I'd like to tell you two stories. And one of these stories is about a garden, and one of these stories is about a school. And I think really both of these stories are about stewardship. And I think both are about why high schoolers should be in charge. So like I said, the first story is about a garden. When I was 14, I walked through the doors of my public high school in Massachusetts with the idea of starting a garden that would provide food for the cafeterias of my school district. And after a lot of mistakes and plenty of mishaps, gradually a team formed. And over that first winter, we made designs, we applied for grants, we planned fundraisers, we acquired tools. And in May of 2008, we dug up an old football pitch on the grounds of my school, and we made this. And over that first summer, we donated over 1,000 pounds of produce to shelters in my region. And when we came back to school in the fall, we did something exciting. We served a salad in our high school cafeteria. And really exciting for me. So in my high school cafeteria, on an average day, they used to sell between 4 and 6 salads. Really great, I know, awesome. That day, a group of high schoolers woke up at 6 in the morning, and they showed up at school, and they harvested tomatoes and lettuce and carrots and cucumbers and peas. And it was food that they had grown themselves on school grounds, and that day, they sold over 70 salads. And the rest, as they say, is history. Because the following year, we turned this into this. We quadrupled the size of the garden. And history teachers started bringing their students down to learn about Native American planting techniques, and science teachers started doing experiments in the gardens, and math teachers started using data from the garden to study statistics, or teach statistics. By the time I graduated high school, by the time I was in my final year, we had a farm stand and 2 sheds. We had a greenhouse, we had an orchard, and we had half an acre of vegetables. We were serving our food 3 days a week in 3 cafeterias in our district, and our small team of 3 students had grown to over 50. And something else even more important happened, because Project Sprout, this garden, began to spread, because we started going around from school to school, first in our region, and then in our state, and then in the other 49 states, and then beyond. And we would go to these schools with our idea of trying to get the students to start gardens. And we would get there, and the teachers would say, sorry, actually, we've already tried to get our kids to start gardens, and they're just not really into it. And we would show up there, and we would talk, and we would leave, and they would start gardens. And so it began to spread. And I think the reason is because although a lot of things changed in my time at Project Sprout, the way the garden looked changed, what we served in the cafeteria changed, and even the students changed because seniors graduated and new freshmen moved in. The one thing that never changed was that it was always student-run. That never changed. It was a student-run garden. There had been other gardens, other school gardens in other schools. There had been other cafeterias that served delicious, healthy food in their lunches. But we were the first to have students doing everything, and that's why it worked in our school, and that's why it was so contagious. So I have one more story about the garden. When I was a senior, I was coming to the end of my high school. I had a month left before graduation, and I was determined to get our last growing season before I left off to a great start. Just had to get that to happen. And what that meant was in about 3 weeks, we had to build 120 garden beds. And one day, well, it wasn't going very well, I'll just say that. And one day, I was there with a friend, and it was a Friday afternoon, and we started the first couple beds, and then we realized that we had to go to a meeting, so we started to leave. And as we left, a car pulled up. And out of the car stepped a boy named George. George was a football player, and he had never been to the garden. And he got out, and he said, hey, guys, can I lend a hand? And we said, oh, sorry, George, we'd love that, but we're actually leaving. We got to go. And he said, well, I actually have about, a little time to kill before a doctor's appointment. Do you mind is there anything I can do? So we said, okay, yeah, sure. Take a shovel and start digging some beds. We left, we went to our meeting, my friend and I. After the meeting, my friend realized that he left his cell phone at the garden. So we went back to the garden, and to our surprise, as we approached, George's car was still there. And when we got out, we looked, and there was George at the other end of the garden, head down, hand on a shovel, finishing his 25th bed. And the next morning, I got to the garden, and it was pretty quiet. There weren't that many people there. It was a Saturday morning. That's our big work day, and there weren't that many people. But it was fine because there was a big party the night before, and I'd been at the party, and I figured a lot of people were just tired, sleeping in, hungover, weren't going to come. But then around 10 a.m., I saw the entire track and field team running over to the garden. And some kids came up to me and said, "Hey, we heard through the grapevine that you needed a hand building beds, so we thought we'd bring the track team to help." I said, "Okay, sure." Then a little bit later, about half the baseball team showed up and started to dig beds. And at around noon, I looked around and I saw kids in baseball uniforms and track uniforms and normal clothes. And there were about 50 kids, and I realized that there were more kids at the garden than there had been at the party the night before. And by 3 p.m., we built our 120th bed, and we were finished 3 weeks ahead of schedule. So I think that story is important because it brings me to the problem that I began to encounter towards the end of my time at high school. Because I saw a lot of that. I saw kids waking up at 6 in the morning to harvest potatoes. I saw kids getting in the garden at 8 a.m. on a Saturday, even if they had been out partying the night before. And I saw, and even though they weren't getting any payment, any credit in school, nothing. And yet, at the same time, I saw the opposite in school. I saw people being unhappy, not engaged, not learning. And I couldn't reconcile the commitment and passion I saw in the garden with the lack of engagement and enthusiasm I saw in classrooms. And I began to ask, why can't kids wake up at 8 in the morning to read Kafka or do a science experiment? And the difference came down to the fact that in the garden, the kids were in charge. And it was about stewardship, that in the garden, they had all the ownership and responsibility that they didn't have in the classroom. That in the garden, we let them be stewards, and so they were stewards. And yet, in the classroom, they were being stewarded. Plants do well to be stewarded. High school students do not. And so this brings me to my second story. Because one day I came home pretty exhausted. I came home from school pretty exhausted, and I sat down at the dinner table with my mom, and I said, "You know what? I'm sick of it. I can't do it anymore. I can't watch people, my friends, not learning anything because there's nothing to engage them. I can't watch people be unhappy 6 hours a day, 180 days a year." And my mom, I think, was a little sick of my whining, said, "Well, you know what?" It's sort of offhandedly. She said, "You know what? Why don't you start your own school?" And there was a pause at the dinner table. And then I said, "Okay, I will." And so what happened over the next year and a half was that I designed and implemented an alternative school within a school at my high school. The principles behind this school were actually based on the principles I learned in the garden, because what made this school unique was that it was student-run. It was a student-run school. And the curriculum that I designed over the next 9 months was based on this quote. And it's inspiration, hunger, these are the qualities that drive good schools. The best we educational planners can do is create the most likely conditions for them to flourish, and then get out of their way. That's Ted Sizer, great maverick of educational reform. And so that was the principle behind the alternative school, was that we would set up the conditions for inspiration and hunger to flourish, and then just get out of the way. And so after getting the project approved over a very long process, we opened the project to applications, and what resulted was 8 students in a pilot program of the Independent Project. So this school I started was called the Independent Project. And there were 8 students in it, and these 8 students represented the whole spectrum of academic achievement. So there were kids who had been coasting through, getting A's easily their entire time, and then there were kids who were on the edge of dropping out. They were really failing. And in 2010, in September of 2010, the Independent Project was launched. And what happened next? Unfortunately, it just crashed and burned. It was a huge failure, so that sucks. No, it didn't happen, fortunately. I wouldn't be here if that had happened, I don't think. So what happened next was actually pretty exciting, because what happened was we saw kids who had just been coasting by because high school was easy for them, challenge themselves more than they had ever been challenged before. And then we saw kids who were failing and on the edge of dropping out, ready to give up, finally find passion in something, and find investment in their learning, and push themselves and do things that I never could have thought was possible. So there's one boy named Matt who before the Independent Project, he was 15, he was the youngest person in the program, and before that, it had been, he was really failing his classes, he was really struggling, and the teachers had decided that, first of all, he wasn't really trying, he didn't really care about it, and second of all, that he needed special help, that he just wasn't going to be able to get there. And I met this kid, and what I learned very quickly was that he had the highest or strictest moral integrity of anyone I'd ever met. And the problem had been that he just didn't find value in what he was being taught, and he just didn't see the point in his assignments. And so his project within the independent project within the school was to write a novel. And I knew he wouldn't really succeed in writing a novel, but I thought that it was really cool that he was going to try. He did succeed. In fact, he wrote two novels with many drafts of each. And by the time the project was finished, he was starting the second draft of his third novel. Matt, who was 15 then, is 17 now. He's still writing, and he just got his first publication in a magazine. I could go on all day telling stories like that because it was really a remarkable period of time. I could tell you about the time that a student told me that he finally thought he knew what real learning was. I could tell you about the time that the whole group decided they were going to overcome their math phobia. But then after all that, something else exciting happened. And what happened was that at the very end of the program, the team decided that what they could offer best to the world was telling their story. And so we made a video, and a 15-minute video that we put on YouTube. And this video got 24,000 hits, and 242 schools contacted us. And these emails were coming in from students and parents and teachers and principals, all saying, and they were coming from our state, and they were coming from the rest of the country, and they were coming from pretty much everywhere else. And what all these emails were saying was, we want to do this. We think our school needs this. We want to try it. And so the idea is spreading. So what's the point of telling these two stories? Is my message that we should have student-run gardens and in every school and have student-run schools in all the schools? No. No. First of all, I think teachers and farmers, they're the salt of the earth. We need them. The world needs them. And second of all, the student-run gardens don't make sense in every setting, in every culture. And the Independent Project was meant to show the capacity of youth, the wonderful things that happen when you put high schoolers in charge, but not as a uniform solution for every school. The truth is, the same problem has different solutions in different places. So if the message of Project Sprout isn't to have student-run gardens in every school, what is it? Well, there are a lot of things I'm proud of about Project Sprout. One is that the cafeteria workers in my high school now know what kohlrabi is. I don't know how many of you know what kohlrabi is, so that's cool. It's a vegetable. And that there are kids in my district who now know that carrots actually grow underground. I think you know that. But the thing I think I'm most proud of is what will happen to the small group of high school students who ran Project Sprout in their time, in their 4 years there. What will happen to them after they graduate? Because some of them will become farmers, I think, and that's great. That's awesome. We need them. We need farmers. But others won't. They will become lawyers or contractors or artists. But I can promise you that all of their lives will be a little bit greener, a little bit more organic because of their time in the garden, because they spent 4 years taking care of a living thing. They fed people. They grew food and they fed people. And because of that, for the rest of their lives, they will be stewards of the land, in whatever form that takes. And the Independent Project? Well, I think those kids did the most important thing of all. They were stewards of themselves. They stewarded their own learning. Even if it was for only one semester, for that semester they had real agency. They were the authors of their own lives for that semester. And for the rest of their lives, they will know that they can take ownership over their lives and that they can be responsible for their effect on the world. They know that no matter what anyone else says now, that they can contribute to society. And once you know you can't help but feel like you have to. Why should high schoolers be in charge? The answer is simple, I think. Because one day, they will be in charge. Because one day, they really will be the stewards of the earth. And when I say earth, I don't just mean the natural world. I mean the planet and society. And in the next 50 years, this earth is going to need a lot of stewardship. Unfortunately, there's bad news. And the bad news is that right now, we are expecting the next generation to be good stewards, and yet we aren't giving them any responsibility at all. In fact, our entire education system is set up to remove responsibility. So we have these strict curriculums, and we have these constant testing and these constant monitoring and lists upon lists of things that they're prescribed to learn. And it doesn't make sense. You can't teach stewardship by not letting them be stewards. You have to let them practice stewardship. If you want high schoolers to grow up, if you want the next generation to take charge in leading us to a better future, you have to let them know what it means to be in charge, what it feels like, what it takes. If you want them to really make change, you have to give them real agency. If you want them to write the story of a better future, then you have to let them be the authors of their own lives. Here's one of my favorite quotes of all time. If you want to build a ship, don't drum up the men to gather wood, divide the work, and give orders. Instead, teach them to yearn for the vast and endless sea. If you want people to build a garden, don't teach them how to weed and water. Make them feel an urgent need to grow vegetables. If you want the inheritors of the earth to be good stewards, don't tell them how the world works. Make them feel a desperate responsibility to care for it. So that's the bad news. The bad news is that we're not doing that. In fact, we're doing the opposite. We're gathering wood and giving out orders. For 4 years, we tell kids what to do, when really what we want is for them to be able to tell themselves what to do. Let me give you an example. So if you had a dog named Frank, all dogs should be named Frank, I think. If you had a dog named Frank, and you knew for whatever reason you were going to leave, you had to leave, and you were going to leave Frank in someone else's care. You couldn't take Frank with you. You had to move to a new place, and you had to leave Frank with a caretaker. Would you call the caretaker on the day you were leaving and say, hey, here's my dog, come pick him up. Come meet him and pick him up? No. Months in advance, you'd call the caretaker and say, please come meet Frank. Come take Frank for an afternoon, get to know him, get to know what it's like to take care of him. You do that for a long time so that by the time you actually left, your caretaker would be very ready to do a good job taking care of your dog. So to the adults in the room, sorry everyone else for a moment, to the adults in the room, Earth is your Frank. And one day, you're going to have to leave Frank in someone else's hands. Don't wait till you have to go to hand off the responsibility. Let the next generation of caretakers practice now. Let high schoolers be in charge. And I want to end on a note of good news, because there is good news, and the good news is that I think we can reverse things. It's not so hard to reverse things. It's not so hard to give high schoolers ownership because they're ready for it. They're ready for ownership. So one day I went down to the garden, and it was supposed to be a day when no one was working, so I wasn't expecting to see anyone. And as I got down there was actually a car, and I saw a mom with a little boy. It looked like he was about 4 years old. And I thought maybe they were there to get vegetables or something, so I went over and started to approach them. And as I approached, the mom said, oh, I'm sorry, I hope we're not bothering you. But my son Parker, whenever we drive by, he says, oh, Mommy, look at my garden. And I never stopped, so today I thought I would stop and let him show me around. And I realized that Parker, this boy, Parker Haynes, was in the after-school program that we had on Wednesdays, and he had been coming every week and working in the garden. So I said, no, that's fine. I'm just here to hang out. Just, do whatever you want. So I went and sat on the edge of the garden, and I watched for a little while as this boy led his mom on a tour. And I couldn't hear everything, and I couldn't see everything, because this boy's about this tall, and some of the tomato plants come up to about here. But I heard some things, and the things I heard were something like, oh, Mommy, look at my peas. And, oh, Mommy, look at my potatoes. We plant them with beans because they grow well together. And after a little while, the mom got sick of all this touring, and she said it was time to go. And as they were walking out, just at the last moment before they left the garden, Parker reached up and grabbed his mom's hand. And he looked up at her with this worried expectancy on his face. And he said, Mommy, do you like my garden? And I looked out at this 12,000 square foot garden. And I looked down at Parker Haynes. And I can't imagine what it would feel like to be 4 years old and feel ownership over something as vast and unwieldy as a 12,000 square foot garden. But here's the best part. He wasn't mistaken. We didn't make him feel ownership. Parker had been at that garden every week planting it alongside me. It was his garden as much as it was mine. So that's the good news. The good news is that, I think, if 4-year-old Parker Haynes can feel ownership over a 12,000 square foot garden, and a group of 8 high school students can feel ownership over their entire education, Well, if we're willing to make some changes, I think we can create a world in which the next generation is prepared to inherit the earth. Thank you.